Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home.
154 years ago today, a Union general walked out onto a balcony in Galveston, Texas, to announce the contents of General Order No. 3, the total emancipation of all those held in the bonds of slavery. By reading this order, the Union general on that balcony brought to an end the original sin that America had carried since the founding of the nation. The holiday of Juneteenth, Freedom Day, can truly be seen as America's second Independence Day. It is celebrated by communities throughout the nation, with parties, cookouts, rodeos, and the celebration of African American history and culture. A cornerstone of many local celebrations comes with the reading aloud the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln's original order that over 2 years prior to General Order No. 3 had pronounced all enslaved individuals in the rebelling Confederate States free. But what is it about the Emancipation Proclamation that has this order take a center place for Juneteenth celebrations? And what is the history that led to the founding of this holiday that is now celebrated across the nation? With every year that passes, our historical connection to these monumental events recede further into the past, and the personal stories of these events are lost or forgotten. It is especially important that in this year of COVID-19, when many are unable to gather for Juneteenth celebrations, that we remember the history that surrounds the holiday. Join us as we present how these proclamations came to be, the role African Americans played in securing their freedom from the oppression of slavery, and why it is important to observe and celebrate Freedom Day, especially in these challenging times. When the Civil War began in 1861, America as a nation was less than 100 years old. However, the institution of slavery predated the founding of the nation by centuries, starting in 1619 when 20 African slaves were brought ashore to the colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Despite those noble words of the Declaration of Independence stating that all men are created equal, this ideal did not apply to the 4.5 million African Americans at the start of the Civil War, whether they were in the North or the South. The concepts of racial inequality and racial inferiority were held by many throughout the U.S. in regards to African Americans. Of the 500,000 free people of African American descent living in the U.S. at the start of the Civil War, half lived in the North and half lived in the South. In the northern states, this took the form of racial segregation and discrimination. African Americans had few civil rights and were not considered citizens. They faced restrictions on travel, the requirement to carry papers showing their freedom, and were unable to testify in a court of law. However, these inequalities pale in comparison to the horrors that were the daily part of life for those who were enslaved. Considered nothing more than property and often treated like cattle, a day in the life of a slave was work from can to cant, from sunup till sundown, and if there was a full moon, and they would work even further. It can be hard for us today to comprehend this lack of freedom, the true banality of evil that was embedded into every moment for those enslaved. But one way we can come close to understanding these experiences is by listening to the voices of those who lived through it. And we now have a chance to listen to the recordings of one such individual. From a recording done in 1941, Mrs. Laura Smalley of Hempstead, Texas, recalls her childhood as a slave and allows us to connect with that terrible past.
She was crying, and Mr. Bethany asked her what was the matter, She told Miss Adeline, and Martha Albert hurt her wrist. And she asked her then, says, what you doing in this house here? Hurting old mister. Said she wasn't hurting old mister. Old mister was not whooping. She saw her down. But the thing that poor old woman carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can't. And round the tree, and whipped her. And well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet. But it just had her clothes all down to her waist, They didn't have her plumb naked, but they had her clothes down to her waist. And every now and then they'd whip her, and then snuff the pipe out on her, Snuff the pipe out on her.
Even when the war that would eventually lead to the end of slavery began in April of 1861, and despite the protests of leaders of the abolitionist movement, African Americans were barred from serving in the United States Army. It would not be until 1863 and the announcement of a proclamation that African Americans would have the chance to fight for their freedom. While African Americans had served in all previous American wars, those wishing to serve found themselves unable to join aside from limited service in the Navy. In the beginning, the war was viewed as a white man's fight, and those same concepts of racial inferiority prevented many leaders from utilizing African American soldiers, out of fear that they would not stand and fight, or would somehow turn to savagery. These racist ideas were countered by abolitionist leaders, such as Frederick Douglass, who knew this was a chance for African Americans to prove themselves and fight for the rights of citizenship.
Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his butt, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Frederick Douglass, 1862.
As the war dragged on into 1863, and the losses for the United States continued to mount, President Abraham Lincoln finally issued a call to arms for African Americans in his January 1st Emancipation Proclamation. Not only did this executive order allow for the enlistment of African Americans into all armed services of the United States, but also had the greater impact of forever freeing all enslaved peoples that were located in the states then in rebellion. Within months, active recruitment of African Americans began on a national level, and by May of 1863, African American soldiers fought their first major battle at Port Hudson. Units such as the famous 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry would prove themselves in vicious fighting across the various theaters of the war. By the last year of the war in 1865, over 180,000 African American men had enlisted in the United States military. And as part of the 25th Army Corps, black units proudly marched into Richmond, Virginia, capturing the capital of the Confederacy. However, despite proving themselves and earning the respect of their commanders, black soldiers continued to endure the tribulations and trials of racism, both from the enemy and within their own command. If an African American soldier attempted to surrender to their Confederate foe, they were often put to death outright or enslaved. And while they were initially promised the same pay as white soldiers at $13 a month, they instead found themselves earning only $10, with a further $3 being deducted for their uniforms. Many units outright refused pay and protested, eventually leading to the receiving equal pay as their fellow white soldiers. The soldiers who fought for their freedom and the rights of citizenship proved themselves without a doubt as the equals of any other unit in the war. And when the war ended in 1865, African American units would continue to serve in the U.S. Army, with the creation of 6 all-black units who would become known as the Buffalo Soldiers. While the Emancipation Proclamation had first been announced in January of 1863, the news of this freedom did not reach those enslaved throughout much of the South, and especially in the state of Texas. Texas was seen as a remote corner of the Confederacy, and many slaves from other states were sent to Texas during the war in an attempt to keep them in bondage. With the news of this freedom, America found itself with a second day with which to celebrate independence. And on the 1-year anniversary of General Order No. 3 in 1866, the first celebrations of what would become the Juneteenth holiday were being held in communities throughout Texas. Even though the hostilities of open war had ended, Many ex-slaves continue to face violence and oppression as they attempted to exercise their newfound freedoms and rights as citizens guaranteed to them in the 14th and 15th Amendments. Many of those previously enslaved in Texas would spread and move throughout the country as they searched to reunite with family members and seek opportunities elsewhere. As they reached new locations and established new communities, they spread with them the holiday and traditions of Juneteenth. These traditions and stories that form the basis of Juneteenth celebrations became woven into the American fabric. And we continue to see many of these traditions, such as parties, barbecues, parades, and the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, continuing to this day. While not yet a federal holiday, Juneteenth continues to be a strong component of the African American community and has come to be recognized by all but 4 states and is celebrated even in other countries. While this Juneteenth will be different as we continue to grapple with COVID-19, the stories and legacies of those who went before and paved the way for the celebration of this holiday will in no way be forgotten. Juneteenth is truly a part of the fabric of America. It serves as a reminder that one day we will make those words of the Declaration of Independence read true, that all men are created equal.